The Oak Ridge Saloon had been standing for over 50 years, a staple in this small Texas town. It was the kind of place where the boots were worn, the whiskey was strong, and respect was something earned. The bar smelled of aged wood, leather, and a hint of cigar smoke. The music from the jukebox hummed in the background, a slow country tune, keeping the atmosphere calm but lively. At the far end of the bar, Hank Lawson sat with his whiskey in hand, his old leather jacket draped over the stool beside him. He was a Marine veteran, 65 years old, with shoulders like steel cables and a quiet, steady presence. His cowboy boots were worn but sturdy, and his Marine Corps cap sat on the counter next to his glass. He had been a lot of things in his life, a soldier, a rancher, a fighter, but he had never been the type to start trouble. Tonight, however, trouble was about to find him. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The doors swung open hard, letting in the smell of city cologne and cheap beer. A group of men stumbled inside, loud, obnoxious, drunk. They wore flashy watches and designer shoes, clearly not from around here. Leading the pack was Chad Walker, a rich investment broker from Dallas, already a few drinks too deep. His slicked back hair and overconfident swagger screamed entitlement. He looked around the bar with a smirk, like he owned the place, before his eyes landed on Hank. "Well, would you look at that?" Chad said loudly, elbowing his friend. "We got ourselves a real-life cowboy sitting all alone." Hank didn't look up. That just made Chad bolder. He stumbled toward the bar, his overpriced boots clunking against the wooden floor. "Hey, old man, you one of those washed-up war vets who sits around waiting for people to buy him drinks?" The bar went quiet. Even the bartender, wiping down a glass, froze. The locals exchanged glances. They had seen men like Chad before, loud, drunk, stupid. But they also knew Hank, and they knew this wasn't going to end well. Hank finally lifted his gaze, his cold, steel blue eyes locking onto Chad. There was no anger, no emotion, just the kind of look that made lesser men rethink their choices. Chad, too drunk to feel the warning in that stare, kept pushing. He reached out and flicked the Marine Corps cap sitting on the bar. "What's this? You wear this around hoping someone thanks you for your service?" A few gasps rippled through the bar. The bartender, Jimmy, took a small step back, like he was preparing for what was coming next. Hank set his whiskey down, slowly, deliberately. Then he turned his entire body toward Chad, his posture still relaxed, but his presence suddenly 10 times heavier. "You done, son." Hank's voice was calm, slow, steady. Chad, still cocky, laughed. "Oh, come on, I'm just having fun. Loosen up, old man." Then he grinned and did the one thing no one in that bar could believe. He patted Hank's shoulder, like he was some damn horse. "You look like you could still hold some weight," Chad chuckled, slurring his words. "Hell, I bet I could hop on your back, and you'd give me a ride around the bar." The bar went dead silent. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the jukebox seemed quieter. Every pair of eyes was locked onto Hank Lawson, waiting, knowing. Chad's friend tried to pull him back, sensing the danger. "Dude, maybe just..." Hank sighed through his nose, his patience gone. He turned back toward the bartender, his voice even. "Jimmy, hold my whiskey." And just like that, it began. The bar was dead silent, the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. Every patron, every bartender, even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. Hank Lawson pushed back his stool, slow and deliberate. His boots scraped against the wooden floor as he rose to his full height. He wasn't the tallest man in the bar, but his presence alone made him seem larger than life. His shoulders, still broad despite his age, squared up, and for the first time that night, Chad Walker felt something other than arrogance. It was the whisper of a warning, but his drunken mind, bloated with cheap whiskey and self-importance, wouldn't let him accept it. "Relax, old man," Chad chuckled, though there was a tremor in his voice now. "I was just messing around. No harm, no foul." Hank's face remained unreadable, calm as ever. His deep blue eyes locked onto Chad, but there was no anger, no threat. Just the weight of experience, the kind of look only a man who had seen war could give. "You ever been in a real fight, son?" Hank's voice was quiet, but the way it cut through the air made it impossible to ignore. Chad scoffed, trying to regain some ground. Please, I've been in plenty of fights. Hank nodded once, as if considering something. Then he took another step closer. Chad tried to stand his ground, but something about the way the old man moved made it feel like the walls were closing in. Let me rephrase that, Hank said. You ever been in a fight that mattered? Chad swallowed, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go down. You ever been in a fight where, if you lost, you didn't get to walk away? Hank's voice was lower now, steady, controlled. A fight where men don't throw cheap punches in bars, but instead, they throw knives in the dark? A fight where you don't get to laugh it off and say you were just messing around? Chad wanted to answer, wanted to laugh, wanted to brush it off like this was nothing, but he couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, he had no words. The entire bar was watching, waiting. Then Hank sighed and shook his head, almost disappointed. You see, son, he said, a man like me, I don't play games, I don't argue with fools, and I sure as hell don't carry another man's weight. Chad flinched. Hank smirked, just slightly. But since you seem so eager to ride something, I figure we can arrange something special for you. Chad blinked. Wait, what? And then, before he could react, Hank whistled. From the far side of the bar, a group of actual cowboys sitting around a poker table looked up, exchanging glances. One of them, a man with a thick mustache and a Stetson hat, grinned wide. Well, well, he chuckled. I think it's time this city boy learns what riding really means. Before Chad could even protest, the cowboys grabbed him. Whoa! Hey, what the hell? Chad yelped, his voice cracking as they dragged him toward the other side of the bar. His arms flailed, his expensive watch catching the light as his feet barely touched the ground. His friends, completely useless, just stared in horror, knowing there was nothing they could do to stop what was coming next. Hank took a slow sip of his whiskey, then turned to the bartender. Turn it up. The jukebox volume rose, and at that moment, Chad realized where they were taking him. The Mechanical Bull. His eyes went wide. No, guys, wait. They threw him on top of it, and the entire bar erupted in laughter. The bartender grinned and hit the switch. The bull lurched forward. Chad screamed, and just like that, the lesson began. The Mechanical Bull jerked forward violently, and Chad barely had time to grab the handle before he was whipped backward, his body flailing like a rag doll. The entire bar erupted in laughter as he let out a high-pitched yelp, his expensive watch slipping off his wrist and clattering onto the floor. Hank Lawson stood by the bar, sipping his whiskey, completely unbothered. He watched as Chad clung to the bull for dear life, his cocky arrogance completely gone. Hold on tight now, city boy, one of the cowboys hollered, slapping his knee as the bull gave another violent twist. Chad's legs flew out, his designer shoes scraping against the machine as he struggled to keep himself upright. His friends stood nearby, too stunned to help, too entertained to intervene. The bartender leaned toward Hank with a grin. You want me to turn it down? Hank shook his head. Nah, let it run its course. The bull jerked to the left, then whipped right, and Chad lost his grip entirely. The crowd gasped, then cheered as he was launched into the air for a brief, almost comedic moment before crashing hard onto the padded mat below. His body hit the ground with a dull thud, his breath knocked out of his lungs. The room roared with laughter. One of the cowboys clapped his hands. Damn! That's gotta be the shortest ride I've seen all year. Chad lay there for a moment, dazed, breathless, and completely humiliated. His hair, which had been slicked back all night, was now a wild mess. His expensive shirt had a rip in the sleeve, and his pants were covered in dust. The bull finally came to a stop, and the bartender leaned over the controls with an amused smirk. Well, guess we found out what happens when a city boy tries to ride something he can't handle. Hank finally stepped forward, kneeling down slightly beside Chad. The veteran tilted his head, watching as Chad groaned in pain, struggling to roll over. That about ride the arrogance out of you, son? Hank asked casually, his voice low and even. Chad blinked, his vision still spinning. He couldn't speak. He had come into this bar loud, cocky, and untouchable. And now? Now he was lying on the floor, beaten by a machine. A waitress appeared beside them, holding out Chad's crumpled-up blazer. Here, sugar. Looks like you dropped something. The bar erupted in laughter again as Chad snatched the jacket from her hand, his face turning an even deeper shade of red. Hank stood up, dusting off his hands. Well, that was fun. He turned back toward the bar, picking up his whiskey and taking a slow sip. Chad finally scrambled to his feet, wobbling slightly as he tried to regain some dignity. His suit was ruined, his ego completely shattered, and worst of all, he knew that everyone here would be talking about this for weeks. Hank glanced back at him one more time, his eyes sharp but amused. "Son, let me give you a piece of advice." Chad swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't answer. Hank smirked. "If you ain't strong enough to handle the ride, maybe you shouldn't climb on the bull." The crowd howled with laughter as Chad's face twisted in humiliation. He knew he had lost. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He knew there was no coming back from this. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the door, shoving past his silent friends. The moment he stepped outside, the bar erupted once again, the sound of clinking glasses and roaring laughter following him into the night. Inside, Hank sat back down at his stool, adjusting his Marine Corps cap before taking another slow sip of whiskey. The bartender chuckled, wiping down the counter. "That never gets old." Hank smirked. "No, it doesn't." And just like that, the night went back to normal. Because real men don't need to prove their strength. They already have. And Chad? He had just learned the most painful lesson of his life. Chad Walker stumbled into the cool night air, his breath still ragged, his body aching from the brutal ride. The once pristine suit he had strutted in with now hung loosely on his frame, the dust and sweat soaking into the expensive fabric. His ego was in worse shape than his body. His hands trembled with rage and humiliation as he reached for his phone, but his fingers barely worked. His friends finally followed him outside, still laughing, but the moment he turned to glare at them, they fell silent. "Not a word," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Jason, his closest friend, held up his hands. "Hey man, no one told you to mess with that guy." Chad's blood boiled. "I wasn't messing with him. I was just..." He stopped, knowing there was no excuse that could fix what just happened. Everyone inside that bar, everyone, had seen him make a fool of himself. And not just a normal fool, but the kind that people would remember. The city boy who walked into the wrong bar. The rich drunk idiot who picked a fight with a veteran and got thrown on a mechanical bull. His name would be a punchline in this town for years. His pride burned. He yanked open the car door and dropped into the driver's seat, slamming it shut. Jason and the others stood outside, shifting awkwardly, unsure whether to get in or let him cool off. Inside, Chad clenched the wheel, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was flushed, his hair disheveled, his once perfect confidence shattered. And the worst part? The old man hadn't even touched him. He had walked in thinking he was the biggest man in the room, only to be put in his place by someone who had already proven everything that mattered. The truth cut deeper than the embarrassment. Chad had spent his entire life thinking respect was something people gave you if you had money, power, or status. But tonight, he had learned something painfully different. Real respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And a man like Hank Lawson? He didn't need to prove anything. Chad exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel tighter as Jason climbed into the passenger seat. "You all right, man?" Jason asked carefully. Chad didn't answer for a moment. His pulse slowed, the weight of his own mistakes settling heavy in his chest. "I was an idiot," he muttered. Jason let out a short laugh. Yeah, you were." Chad shook his head. "I don't get it, man. That guy, he didn't even need to do anything. He just stood there, and He groaned, rubbing his hands over his face. Jason leaned back in the seat, looking out at the bar. "That's the difference, man. You've always had to run your mouth to feel like the biggest guy in the room, but guys like him, they already are." Chad didn't say anything. For the first time in a long time, he actually listened. Inside the bar, Hank sat at his stool, the night moving on as if nothing had happened, because for him, it hadn't. Men like Chad came and went, but Hank had seen real men, real fights, real life and death battles. A loudmouth in a suit didn't even register. The bartender leaned against the counter. "Think that kid'll ever come back here?" Hank smirked. If he's got half a brain, he won't. The bartender chuckled and poured him another whiskey. On the house. Hank tipped his glass in thanks and took a slow sip. And just like that, the night went back to normal. Because real men don't need to prove their strength. They already have. And Chad? He had just learned the most unforgettable lesson of his life.